Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'll be discussing the historic, frankly, Prime Minister's questions from yesterday when, for the first time ever, the Prime Minister fielded questions without actually being physically in Parliament. Now, those questions included, of course, the COVID pandemic handling, but were initially focused on the singular danger that Boris Johnson poses to the United Kingdom, as exemplified by his latest attack on devolution. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, Boris Johnson is not able to attend Parliament in person either this week or next week due to having to self-isolate. He'd been in close contact with a Conservative MP who subsequently tested positive. Fine, fair enough. Except the usual procedure for PMQs when the Prime Minister can't attend for whatever reason is you send your deputy. So I was expecting Dominic Raab to take over, and I was wondering, so does that mean Keir Starmer would step aside and let Angela Rayner go again? But Dominic Raab took over when Johnson was actually ill earlier this year. But Boris Johnson instead decided to conduct the sessions himself remotely via video link. Now, I am fully supportive of this, but it is absolutely rank hypocrisy, because the reason why MPs have not been able to do much more of this, taking part remotely in parliamentary sessions, is because Johnson's government forced Tory MPs to vote against it. So we had the case, for example, last week of a Conservative MP, a member of his own party, who was not allowed to take part in a debate on breast cancer because she was receiving treatment for, wait for it, breast cancer, and couldn't attend in person. She wasn't allowed to participate remotely. When Keir Starmer was having to self-isolate while he waited for a member of his family to receive their COVID test results, he couldn't turn up to Parliament either, and so he replaced himself with his deputy Angela Rayner. Not the case with Boris Johnson. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand. Normally, you'd think Boris Johnson would be delighted to get out of PMQs. They are a futile exercise for him in damage limitation after all, and he's well known for not liking people questioning him. But he obviously feared letting Dominic Raab do them even more. And who can blame him when you consider how he was torn apart by Starmer in April? The other thing I will say is actually Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, was doing this remote link-up, and the sound quality was appalling. You guys thought I've had sound issues in the last week or two. You should have heard this travesty. But anyway, before I get on to Starmer's questions, one shameless bit of party politics I couldn't help let slide. So Johnson, by the way, is always trying to make claims that other parties are playing party politics and we should all muck in together. But of course, he does it at every given opportunity. He planted a question for one of his backbenchers to ask about some issue in Romford. I can't really relay what it is exactly. I could have tried to look it up and understand it. It doesn't really matter because the time taken to fully understand it makes no difference. Apparently, it was some issue caused by something being put in place 50 years ago that was intended to be temporary and is now still there. It hasn't been replaced, causing an issue. And the MP said that Boris Johnson himself had been shown the issue by that MP whilst he was Mayor of London. And then he turned it into a question in the form of laying the blame at the feet of the current Mayor of London, who is Labour's Sadiq Khan. But then you think to yourself, so hang on a minute. So if this is an issue, this was an issue when Boris Johnson was Mayor, because you showed it him. You said this is a bit of an issue, Mayor of London Johnson. Then why didn't he do something about it at the time? Johnson also tried to say that Khan had blown London's transport budget. And they keep trying to do this, say that Sadiq Khan has bankrupted transport for London. No, he hasn't. In actual fact, the finances are in much better shape than when Johnson was mayor. Johnson tried to say it was the other way around. But in actual fact, that's demonstrably untrue because Johnson blew a right load of public money on projects that were never built. In other words, all that money was wasted. And he closed down facilities to try and cover the costs. But anyway, shameless party politicking aside, on to Starmer's questions. So the first one on devolution. Starmer regarded devolution as one of the proudest achievements of the last Labour government. And he said, that the issue of devolution had been met with broad agreement, had cross-party support, really. So why did Boris Johnson this week call Scottish devolution a disaster? To which Johnson didn't deny it or answer the question. He just used it to grandstand. This time, not against Starmer and Labour, but he just used it to attack the SNP, saying that they're using devolution as a mission to break up the UK. It's like, well, I mean, they do want independence for Scotland. What do you expect them to do? Really? I mean, the Conservatives wish to use the UK to enrich themselves and their mates, and that's what they do. How can you complain at the SNP for using the situation to try and encourage Scottish independence? That is their raison d'etre. The other thing is he got the name wrong as well. He called them the Scottish Nationalist Party. Now, I do that at times myself, have to hold my hands up. It's Scottish National Party. But at the same time, you can't get these things wrong in Parliament. You probably shouldn't at all, but you can't get it wrong in Parliament, and the Speaker did have to correct the Prime Minister. Now, at this point, I do have to say Johnson didn't do himself any favours, and it'll come on to my next point in a minute, what Starmer said. He offered an apology, and I thought, OK, you've apologised, that's fine. But he turned that apology into another little dig by saying, oh, I mean, they are nationalists, aren't they? National, but not nationalist, blah, blah, blah. It's just the name of the party, you dickhead. Get over it. So then Starmer stood up and he said, look, the single biggest threat to the UK is the Prime Minister whenever he opens his mouth on this. And as a former lawyer, Starmer could have said, and I present to you, my lord, Exhibit A, what Boris Johnson has literally just said. But, when Starmer said, look, the single biggest threat to the UK is the Prime Minister, there was a lot of noise of approval in the chamber. And the thing is, even Johnson's own MPs know this to be true, because there are members of the Conservative Party who don't give a crap about the union, of course. But there are ones who do. And they know. The thing is, Boris Johnson was sat there as well, because it showed you the picture of him. He was just smirking, as if he was practicing being Priti Patel's body double or something. He doesn't give a crap. And it's not that you could argue he disagrees with the assessment. That's not true. One thing that Conservatives, including Boris Johnson, he proved this last year for the general election campaign. One thing they do is they spend a lot of money. They put a lot of effort into making sure they gauge public opinion. I know, how do you expect all the U-turns? That's simple, Dominic Cummings. That's him listening to Dominic Cummings. Normally the Conservatives pay attention to public opinion. They need to in order to mould it to their will. He knows he is having a detrimental impact on the strength of the union. He knows that because he will be being told that. And he sits there grinning like a Cheshire cat. Then Starmer reeled off some examples of his undermining devolution, including not engaging with devolved administrations during the COVID pandemic, as well as obviously his comments there and the internal market bill. And he said to Johnson, says, does the Prime Minister agree that we need far more devolution? To which Johnson then tried bringing Tony Blair into it. So, well, even Tony Blair didn't foresee the rise of the SNP. And he just used it to bang on about the SNP again. And then he said, maybe Starmer's in favour of this. Is he in favour of the breakup of the UK? To which Starmer, of course, said, of course I don't want to break up the UK. But if anything is fueling that breakup, it is the Prime Minister. Again, large murmurs of approval. The House essentially agrees with this. They know this in all parties. I'm not suggesting Tory MPs were murmuring their approval, but usually what happens in Parliament, if one side murmurs or roars their approval, the other side try and counter it. There was no counter. Then Starmer turned to COVID handling, pandemic handling. And he said, look, it's good to see the Prime Minister is self-isolating. That's the right thing to do. He says, but does he think he could do it if all he had to rely on was statutory sick pay, £95 a week, or the one-off payment of £500? To which then Johnson said, look, the support has been outstanding and exceptional. It is not. If you look up statutory sick pay in the UK and you put it alongside what it is in comparable European countries, it's embarrassingly pathetic. Genuinely pathetic. And he tried to then say, it's good to see Starmer's at last supporting the measures. Oh dear. He's been doing this for a while, trying to say, trying to mech out that Starmer's against something, then suddenly changing his mind so he's for it. It's not really going to stick, but this time he really left himself open. And so Starmer, sometimes I do think that Starmer misses opportunities. He didn't miss this one. It was wide open goal. And he stood up and he said, look, I'm not going to take lectures on supporting from the Prime Minister when the measures were passed with Labour votes. He said 32 of his own MPs broke a 3-line whip. For those who don't know what that means. So when the party leadership instructs their MPs how to vote, you whip them to vote. You just do a what's sometimes called a 1-line whip, which is basically, we'd like you to vote this way if you can be bothered. If you're not in the area, don't worry about it. 2-line whip is basically, if you're here, you should vote this way. 3-line whip is you are coming here and you are voting this way. This is ultra important. So he noted that 32 of them broke that 3-line whip. And he hears about 50 of them have joined a WhatsApp group to discuss ways of opposing Johnson next time round. And Starmer said he should be thanking us for our support, not criticising. And I'll just remind people after that, the reason Boris Johnson is doing this remotely, because he didn't have to, he could have just sent Dominic Raab. The reason he's doing it remotely is because he thinks Dominic Raab would make an even bigger mess of it than he would. For those, bear in mind, when the leadership election comes inevitably next year, Dominic Raab is one of the names in the hat. I don't think he would get it, but if he did, this is why I won't be unhappy at the prospect. I will not be unhappy at the prospect. Dominic Raab. So bad that even Boris Johnson doesn't want him fronting PMQs anymore. Then Starmer pointed out there's only 1 in 8 workers even qualifies for the one-off payment to isolate. He said MPs may be able to afford to isolate, but that's not the case for many of the people who send those MPs there. He noted that an estimate is only about 11% of people who are asked to isolate are doing so. And he said this is not because people don't want to. In some cases, I'm sure it is. He says it's because they can't afford to. In the majority of cases, that will be the case. He says, does the Prime Minister recognise that in order to get this right, we need to make it easier and affordable to isolate? Again, Prime Minister just reiterated his same answer, talked about the support given to people, but as Starmer noted, he's focusing on the support given. What Starmer's trying to talk about is the support not given. He just won't face up to the fact that there are gaps. Which is what Starmer then said for his 5th. He said, look, the Prime Minister has to understand there is a huge gap in the system. If you can't afford to isolate, then there is little point in getting a test or engaging with the tracing programmes. And then he said, but the government say they can't afford to fund that, but they can afford £21 million to pay a go-between to deliver lucrative contracts for the Department for Health. Now, this relates to another little bit of COVID contract corruption that I need to discuss at some point. I try and stretch these out a little bit. They're not the most popular topics, but they are important topics. So at some point, I'm going to get onto that. But there are now so many cases of COVID corruption coming up now that you can expect the government to be pressed on them at an increasing rate. But at the same time, I'm not going to increase the number of videos I do on them because people don't really like them, if we're honest. So then Starmer noted, and I was glad he did this because he doesn't always do this. Starmer said that's £21 million. And then he reminded the Prime Minister that a few weeks ago, Boris Johnson said he couldn't find that exact amount of money for free school meals over half term. Now, the government have U-turned on the free school meals thing for this Christmas and next year, but it came too late for the week half term last month. So last month, those kids went hungry because of this exact amount of money. And then Starmer said, look, does the Prime Minister think that £21 million for a middleman was an acceptable use of taxpayers' money? To which, of course, Johnson had no answer, but he did have a response. He said, we're very proud of our record here. And then he said, Labour, first of all, said that we were going too slow on procurement, and now they're saying we're going too fast. He said, no, that's not what he's saying. You were going too slow because you were trying to work out how you could milk the system. They were going too slow. They still are going too slow. Because when you look at the actual PPE that's getting delivered, it's still happening too slowly. The problem is that when you give contracts to accountancy firms, pest control firms, and so on, when actual manufacturers of medical grade PPE were being ignored and producing supplies for other countries. That's the problem there. Then Starmer, now for his sixth question, it's like I always say, it's one of these, Johnson's going to stand up and talk a load of all crap, and Starmer can't make any sort of comeback. So you might as well just make a point or ask a question where it makes no difference if Johnson doesn't answer it. So he decided to just poke at Johnson for the sixth question. Plenty to do with it now. And he used the idea of the circuit break because Boris Johnson, again, unwisely had tried to use the old Captain Hindsight moniker. Ain't working anymore, son. So Keir Starmer said, look, this circuit break that we called for weeks ago, weeks before it was implemented, that Boris Johnson said would be a disaster and he won't do it, then he caught up. He says, we've now got, as a result of that delay, a longer, harder lockdown. So I'm not going to take that from him. And then he said, look, last week, the Prime Minister couldn't explain how the government paid £150 million for contracts that didn't deliver a single usable bit of PPE. Again, Boris Johnson keeps trying to talk about all the PPE he's ordered. In reality, I'd like to know what is the actual number of usable PPE, because it's not as much as he's saying, because quite a lot of it either doesn't arrive or when it arrives, it's not the right stuff, not even usable. So yeah, £150 million that didn't deliver a single bit of usable PPE. And then Starmer said this week he's defending the paying of £21 million on a contract with no oversight. Then he noted this morning the National Audit Office concluded that the government's approach was diminished public transparency. More than half of all contracts relating to the pandemic, that's £10.5 billion, were given out without competitive tender, and that suppliers with political connections were 10 times more likely to be awarded contracts. And then Starmer said, 8 months into the crisis, the government are still making the same mistakes. Can the Prime Minister give a guarantee that from now on, all contracts will follow the proper process with full transparency and accountability? Boris Johnson gave no such assurance, as you will be, I'm sure, amazed to hear. He just, first of all, he said all contracts will be published in a due way. No, they're not, because the due way is 30 days after they're issued. Within 30 days of being issued, they have to be published. That is not happening. Even months later, that is not happening. So that's just a straight up lie. They're not being published in a due way. Then he waffled on a bit about something that had nothing to do with anything, let alone the question. The problem with Boris Johnson, he just doesn't get PMQs. It's Prime Minister's question. You're supposed to answer questions. And if you're not going to answer the question, you're at least supposed to avoid the questions. You're not supposed to just... He thinks he's at a dinner party where he can just change the subject when he gets bored. But then Ian Blackford, of course. Now, I was waiting with bated breath for this. Very uncomfortable for me. Very uncomfortable. Not unreasonable of Ian Blackford to ask these questions, though. So I did notice, first of all, though, because I've had a little comment or two about Ian Blackford's arrangements when he's done it at home. I always say when he does it with the bookcase behind him, it looks way better than when he does it in the other place. But now Boris Johnson was doing PMQs remotely and Ian Blackford was in Parliament. They keep missing each other. It's like Superman and Clark Kent. I do hope they're not the same person. But anyway, Blackford reeled off a list of things that a Westminster government, both Labour and the Conservatives, have delivered, imposed, if you like, that his party and government would have opposed. The illegal Iraq war, Brexit, tuition fees. Although, as he noted in his next bit, tuition fees aren't really the case for Scotland, so I'm not really sure why he brought it up. And so on. He gave a few others, including, of course, the austerity cuts. And then he listed some achievements of the devolved Scottish Parliament. So coming full circle here with Johnson complaining about the SNP politicking. But like I said, on this occasion, fair enough. You know, Blackford prepared the question ahead of time. Of course, he was always going to ask it. But given what Johnson had said earlier on, frankly, I don't blame him. And then he asked if the Prime Minister understands why the people of Scotland think it's him, and referring to Johnson and his Parliament, that are the real disaster. Now, a clever Prime Minister at this point will have noted the achievements that Blackford listed for the Scottish Parliament and have shown, well, this is exactly why devolution is such a great boon for the country, because you're listing off all these things, which just shows how much power you have to determine things, do things your own way. Unfortunate, because that's a where you get a lot of problems if you're going to talk about politicking here. Everyone engages in party politics, and they should, because it's just how politics works. This is why I've complained a lot over the last few years with Labour, because they haven't played party politics well. They need to. So what the SNP generally do is, whenever there's something working well in Scotland, they say it's down to them, and sometimes it is. But whenever something's not working well, they say it's down to Westminster, which again, sometimes it is, but it isn't always. There's this confusion amongst a lot of people in Scotland as well as the rest of the UK about what exact powers the Scottish Parliament have and the Scottish Government, and what the Westminster Parliament and the UK Government have as well. And so, you know, you play a blame game in party politics. It's unfortunate, it's just the way it is. But unfortunately, the thing is, we don't have a clever Prime Minister. The Prime Minister could have said, you have all this power, you know, and my internal market bill is giving you even more powers, which is not untrue. It is a power grab, but it's like giving them a few powers and then not giving them a load of others. So it is a power grab, but you can argue the toss. Unfortunately, we don't have a clever Prime Minister. We have one that I will remind you, Starmer, at the start of this process, pointed out that he furthers the cause of independence every time he opens his mouth. Unfortunately, in response to Ian Blackford, Boris Johnson opened his mouth. He even referred Blackford to the answer he gave earlier. He couldn't even be asked to pretend to answer Blackford specifically. It wasn't the same question as Starmer had asked. He couldn't even be asked to think up a different way of saying the same old bollocks. And it's that sort of lack of respect that is going to further the SNP's cause all the more. Then Blackford just doubled down on the same thing. It wasn't really another question. It was the same question. And, you know, he just noted in there, the real disaster is another 20 years of a Westminster Parliament. But actually, do you know what? It stung Johnson. It really hit home in a way that genuinely surprised me, because Boris Johnson, in trying to answer it then, he blustered in a way that's like he doesn't know what to say. He's like, I don't agree. I mean, that's easy to say to any question, isn't it? I don't agree. He just bumbled. He couldn't work out what to say. And that is the sad take home from the state of affairs right now. I will be crystal clear. Many of you who watch these videos regularly know this. I am opposed to the breakup of Britain, at least with all my heart. I understand that Ireland should be reunified, but Britain. But it is undeniable that Boris Johnson and the Conservatives are the party above all parties who will break up the union. Won't be the SNP. The SNP want the breakup of the union, but they couldn't even deliver it when they had the opportunity for a referendum during the height of austerity, the Conservatives' austerity, and the SNP couldn't even win the referendum then. They couldn't possibly deliver it without the massive boost to their cause that the Conservatives are giving them. But there it is. It's going to be a sad second half of my life. I spent the first half of my life, I don't know when I'm going to die, but I'm middle-aged-ish. Apparently I'm not officially middle-aged according to my partner, but I'm middle-aged. And I spent the first half of my life, therefore, developing a certain affection for my country. And then these arseholes, within the space of a few reckless years, have laid the groundwork for its almost inevitable destruction. But on that cheery note, I'll leave it there. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.